It's really a pleasure to be here, see some familiar faces and some haven't had a chance to meet, and I'm really excited to be able to share with you the results of really kind of cutting edge, high tech in a lot of ways, investigations going on at Gary Melcher's home and studio to help us try and get a definitive date for the construction, the initial phase of construction of the historic House Belmont. Now, despite the title, I hope you will not find this presentation boring. Another joke. Now, this is going to be interesting, the finger swipe thing. Let's see what happens. Well, that did work. The early history of the site that would become Belmont in the colonial era is documented to a fair extent, though there are gaps. Not surprising, really. In 1678, Thomas Vickers obtained a patent from Herbert Jeffreys, governor of the colony of Virginia, for 1,260 acres on the north side of the Rappahannock River, above and below the falls. In 1690, Vickers willed the land to his daughter Martha Todd. The town of Falmouth was carved out from the original 1678 patent in 1727. John Dixon bought most of the remaining property from Martha Todd in 1748. 1775, John Dixon sold the land where Belmont is now located to John Richards, owner of Richards Hill on the present-day Ingleside Drive. I think it gets Pill Hill sometimes as a name as well. All the doctors have moved there. The July 22nd, 1778 will of John Richards states, "I bequeath as follows to my daughter Patty Horner 1 acre of land adjoining that I gave my daughter Elizabeth Triplett near the town of Falmouth to her and her heirs forever." Patty Richards married John Horner in 1777. Now, we had a couple of potentially conflicting genealogical records here. One indicates that Patty Horner died around 1796, while other sources indicate John Horner lived until about 1819. And so we're not totally firm on those, but we do have evidence that the Horners sold the property to Dr. Alexander Vass. The deed for the sale of the lot from Horner to Vass is lost, unfortunately. But a deed from 1807, when Vass sold the house to Thomas F. Knox, refers back to his purchase of the lot from Patty and John Horner, thus indicating that she was apparently alive at the time of the sale. Remember, she died in 1796, so we're kind of working off what we can infer here. Now, a Virginia Herald advertisement on May 31st, 1805, at least that's the first instance that I saw it, and I think it did appear subsequent times, notified the public in September that Dr. Vass was to relocate from Falmouth to Stevensburg, or his plantation not far from it, where he means to practice physic, surgery, and midwifery as heretofore. You may also, I'm sure, be aware that Dr. Vass was, I guess you could say, the company surgeon, company doctor for Rappahannock Forge, Hunter's Iron Works, during the time of his residence here. Now, this advertisement noted that Vass offers for sale his house and lot, reference to a house, on an elegant and healthy situation adjoining Falmouth. This advertisement confirms that a house was built at Belmont before 1805. It was not until 1807 that the house sale did occur. Thomas Knox purchased the property, though his mother, Susanna Knox, pictured here, was listed on later insurance policies as the owner. A tax inventory of 1815 shows that she had 1 cow and a dwelling worth $2,000. Her total tax bill was $12.22. Clearly, Scott Majowski was not the commissioner of the revenue at that time. I was hoping he would be here so I could really do that to him in person. Now, to bring us rather quickly through the subsequent phases of Belmont's ownership and its modifications, Susanna Knox died in October 1823. She's buried in the Union Church Cemetery in Falmouth. The following ad, the ad shown here, was placed in the Virginia Herald on January 3rd, 1824. Belmont for sale. First written evidence of the use of the name Belmont that we found. The highly improved property of the late Mrs. Susanna Knox, adjoining the town of Falmouth, is for sale. On the premises is a large and well-furnished dwelling house and every necessary outhouse, all in good repair. The healthiness of this beautiful spot commanding an extensive view of Falmouth, Fredericksburg, and the surrounding country. Its contiguity to the best society and good schools makes it a most desirable residence. A great bargain may be had in this property if application is made immediately, and the terms of payment will be accommodating. William A. Knox and John S. Knox. Now, it's not clear if application was made immediately, but the property was sold sometime between January 1824 and 1825-26. We don't have not at least discovered a record, but the purchaser was Joseph Burrell Ficklin, who placed the following advertisement in the Virginia Herald of December 23rd, 1826. I'm so glad the Virginia Herald has been digitized so I can pull these things out and show. For rent, that very healthy and pleasant situation overlooking the towns of Falmouth and Fredericksburg and known by the name of Belmont. Note the spelling is a little different than what we're used to. Is for rent the ensuing year, and that's important for and for terms which will be moderate, applied J.B. Ficklin. He only intended apparently to rent it for about a year, and I guess that was why the terms would be moderate for whoever decided to be the tenant. We think that Ficklin likely occupied Belmont sometime late in 1827 or 1828, and he started enlarging the property around 1828, taking the initial center section and expanding it. He eventually created an impressive estate near his growing business enterprises in Falmouth and Fredericksburg, and we have a mutual assurance policy of 1829 that lists him as the occupant of Belmont. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen Joseph Burrell Ficklin before. This is a portrait that came down through the family, and for many years it resided among descendants in North Carolina. And Mr. Dan Walker, one of those direct descendants of J.B. Ficklin, and his relatives, as a family, donated this portrait to Gary Melcher's home and studio. And we're very excited. And this is how the portrait looked when it came to us. It's about 2 years ago, maybe? And we work with an excellent conservation facility in Richmond Conservation Laboratory. They've done a lot of our paintings. And this is what they did with J.B. Ficklin's portrait.
Yay.
Look at the details that have come out there. That whole backdrop, in fact, the conservators are well versed enough in the trade that they're in that they have given us some pretty good evidence that they can identify the artist because of that backdrop, because of a stamp on the back of the canvas of another example that's the same as the stamp on the back of this canvas. This was done in Philadelphia. It was done circa 1840. We understand that there were business interests of Ficklin's there, but it's still an area that requires further research. He's holding an envelope addressed to him in Philadelphia, which is unusual. If you've seen Wuthering Heights, he looks like Heathcliff, or how I pictured Heathcliff. But we're extremely happy in this portrait that we are getting a frame fabricated for it because the original, the frame it came with, we don't believe was original, was heavily damaged. Fell off the wall a couple of times down at the family house. So once we can get all that together, sometime next year, we'll be putting this on exhibit at Gary Melcher's home and studio. And this is part of kind of a larger effort that we're developing to tell more of the story of Belmont beyond the Melcher story, which is the main story we tell, but there is so much context before that we want to delve into of the white owners of the property, of the enslaved and free African Americans who worked there over generations, even of the Native American inhabitants who were in the region prior. So we're trying to fold that into a series of things, both exhibits, history tours we want to do. So we're going to try to be expanding, that story. And J.B. Ficklin's going to help us do that. So the Ficklin family owned Belmont from the time of the acquisition around 1824, 25 or so, until 1916. They are the longest tenured family of this property. And it was to Gary and Corinne Melchers that they sold the house in 1916. Now, in terms of what it looked like, before photography, the only image that we know of the house is from this sketch And I think this is an A.R. Wood sketch. I forgot to look. Yeah, Helen's nodding. Good. I got confirmation in there. It's it's after April 1862. It's after the skirmish that John Hennessy called the Battle of Arby's. Union and Confederate forces skirmishing April 18th, 1862, with the Confederates falling back, but the Union kind of being repulsed long enough for all the bridges to be burned over the Rappahannock, including, and I don't know if I can point to it, but outside the red box there, which is Belmont, there's the property, there's the house. You see the ruins of the bridge there. That's the Falmouth Toll Bridge that J.B. Ficklin owned and suffered a great loss. That and his mills destroyed. But this is the earliest depiction we have of Belmont. We do have a view of the house there on the right from 1916, the year that Ficklin's heirs sold it to Gary and Corinne Melchers and their dogs, who were right there. We also know that the Melchers did the last phase of what we'll call historic renovation and expansion to Belmont. This took place over a series of years after they moved there as a part-time residence and later pretty much full-time beginning in 1916. Melchers died in 1932, Mrs. Melchers in 1955. They expanded the house once more, creating kitchen space, sunroom, and bedrooms and bathrooms above, and really put it in the state that it would be when it was bequeathed to the Commonwealth. Okay. So, despite that, not too bad written record that we had, and some of the other sources that helped try to inform us on the early history of the property, we did not know a precise date of initial construction. That's still a bit of a mystery. Until very recently. And to solve that mystery, we turn to these guys. On the left is Dr. Daniel Miles, who founded the Oxford Dendrochronology Laboratory in 2010 after 30 years in England of studying traditional building techniques working with different preservation organizations. At right is Dan's frequent collaborator on this side of the Atlantic, Michael Cuba, who is the principal of Transom Historic Preservation Consulting, located outside of Philadelphia. They have undertaken, the two of them, many investigations using dendrochronology throughout historic sites, both private and public, in the eastern United States. And among the ones sort of close to us that they have done before coming to Belmont were Mount Vernon. They helped establish which treaties there were put in by George Washington, or would have been, and versus others that were not. And most recently, the Mary Washington House, where they were doing dendrochronology there. So they were the perfect team to help us explore Belmont's origins. So, basic principles of dendrochronology or tree ring dating. What is it really? Okay, that's my presentation. You've been great. Thank you. That sums it all up.
Okay, that's
yeah, the far side usually nails it, yes. It's a little more complicated than that. Trees grow in ways that are heavily influenced by a lot of different factors. Climate, the soil that they're in, the topography generally, even cosmic rays. And I'm not going into all that, but there's a lot of information about what cosmic rays have done in recorded or prehistory, but with evidence to show how that can affect growth. So there are a number of different factors, and as we generally all learn in school, each year that a tree grows, roughly a new ring is produced as it grows out from its initial twig or sapling. So here's the anatomy of a tree, and it gets to how dendrochronology works. Because if you're going to be looking at wooden timbers that have been harvested from a tree, you want to find the evidence of the area that you see here called the cambium. That is the area just under the bark layer, and that represents the last active living growth period of that tree's life. That last ring before it sort of dies off, and it's almost like hair at that point. It's there, but it's sort of inert and dead. As long as it's in the cambium layer, it is still actively growing wood. You cut down the tree at that point, you have stopped the life cycle of that tree. So, the way to do the sampling procedures, as Dr. Miles, who put some of this material together, and I like that we had said that, how to sample an object without destroying it, because that's certainly not the goal. Core sampling, there are actually several ways you can do dendrochronology, including on furniture pieces, and there are ways to do it, but when you're talking about wooden framing members of a house or some other building, the most common method is core sampling. And if you've seen Arctic scientists who were drilling down through layers of ice to get a climate record over years, this is kind of the same idea. By using a special hollow drill, you find a framing timber or some other wood specimen, very importantly, with a bark edge to it. You want to find the place where you will know that you're going into what was that tree's last living year, as represented by that bark edge. And of course, when you frame out, or when you saw up logs, you try to get maximum use, and you're cutting all over, and there'll be some that come out with no bark at all along them, beams and things like that. But a lot of other framing timber, especially 18th, early 19th century, especially when a lot of handwork was being done, you could still get bark edge on some of those. And that's what our investigators were looking for. So the challenge was to see if that circa 1790s date that we used for so long was real. That's what's going to be put to the test. Now, with the assistance of Michael Spencer, my colleague at University of Mary Washington in the Department of Historic Preservation, the central section of Belmont was assigned 4 areas for investigation, rated from the lowest to the highest priority. And you can kind of, I don't know if you can see that well on these screens here, but we've basically got priority 1, which is right in the center, and priority 2, the 1 is the blue one there on the plan, priority 2 is the sort of, I guess, red or pink one there. Priority 3 is yellow, and you can see they're all clustered within a certain portion there of the center section. And priority 4 was challenging because there were not as many potentially useful samples to be harvested, if you will, for specimens. So we had to kind of concentrate principally on priorities 1, 2, and 3. We also had some limitation of time and cost. We had a short amount of time for this work to be done, so we concentrated on where we thought the best yield might be. And again, this is what they're looking for. They're looking for a timber like this that will give them that bark edge and allow them to try and get the most accurate reading they can from that piece of wood. Now, this is just another example for scale from outside the building of where those priority areas are. 3 is not really shown on this just because of the angle, but it's kind of toward the back. Now, in addition to the modifications that Mr. and Mrs. Melchers made, and all the ones done prior, when UMW took over as Mary Washington College at that time in the 70s, they did the first of a series of different renovations to make it code compliant, for one thing, the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, the electrical, the plumbing, and to also prepare it for being a publicly accessed site. So that meant, and of course anyone who has an old house or has been to the back stairs of historic houses, they're open to the public especially, you're going to see these sorts of things here. Vents and plumbing and lighting and alarm systems and all sorts of stuff, snaking through every area possible. They actually opened up the basement more, poured a concrete floor in it, so quite a lot of modification. And it would prove a little bit challenging for our intrepid investigators. You can see here in the next couple of slides, they just have to be contortionists sometimes to get to where they needed to be to get those samples. But they've done this a long time, and they're pretty good at what they're doing. Ultimately, whoops, so there's just one more example of where they're kind of working in those tough spaces there. So this is back on kind of a plan view that shows the areas bored. There were 20 samples taken in total, and those red numbers, if you can make those out, show you within the different priority areas where they got samples. So there's pretty good distribution between principally the 3 areas. They got some in area 4, but the 3 highest priority areas, they got a pretty good return. And for each sample taken, there's a little bit of a sketch here, documentation of it, that would show exactly where it was, where the angle of their bore went in, and just sort of the field notes, if you will, the work that they were doing. They would use that back in the lab to guide the next phases. So this is the finished product. Now I'm going to pass this around. This is not one of the Belmont ones. They gave me this one from another site, and it was not a usable sample, but it's useful as a tool. If you wanted to just get a sense there, it looks like I'm handing out cigars. That's what the payoff is for this work, getting a core sample like that can then be subjected to really sophisticated analysis back in the Oxford Dendrochronology laboratory. You get a little sense here of, I think those are samples probably up on the wall there. They've got different scientific instruments that can get down to electron microscope sort of levels to examine what those cores show them. One of the key components in dendrochronology is the documentation of chronologies of various tree species in different regions. This can provide a baseline of known growth rates and timelines to which samples such as those from Belmont or the Mary Washington House can be compared. And you see some of these chronologies established in everywhere from almost really New England, mid-Atlantic states down here into Virginia by 3 different entities. Oxford has done the most, those pink rings there, but then 2 other dendrochronology specialists or companies have done a certain amount, mostly to the north of us. But these are helping provide comparative data to judge our samples against. Now, the tables above contain math that I do not understand, and so I'm not going to attempt to fake it. There are a lot of really, really complex formulas involved in arriving at dendrochronology conclusions. They are based on really decades of research into this, and they really look like the algebra final that you would take at MIT in working some of these equations. But the part regarding the comparative chronologies you can see at the bottom. There are other areas that have been investigated, and the next to the last there is the Mary Washington House, with a reference chronology of 1799. So they were comparing the Belmont samples to those that they had taken from other areas that had some known dates established. And this is our smoking gun, if you will, the smoking core samples. If you look to the far right, if you can read that, you can see what the felling seasons and the date ranges were for the trees that the lumber came out of that they sampled. 1790, the winter of 1799, 1800 is most prevalent. There's a few a little bit earlier, 1788 to 89, but most of them are 1799 to 1800. And wood in the 18th century for house construction and other buildings was usually worked green. It was more supple, more workable then. I think it's a little different for how we look at it today, where you don't usually want green wood, but it was more common then, within a year roughly of felling, to use that timber. And so, based on other examples and those practices, we can say that the trees at Belmont were felled in the winter of 1799, 1800, and within the good weather of 1800, anywhere from spring into early fall, is when they were worked and put into the house construction. I was fascinated by this when I looked at it. If you look at the number of rings column, which I'm pointing to, but you can't see, it's showing the number of rings. Now, the number of rings is not always exactly correlated to the actual age of the tree, but it's not too far off. There are trees that were in there. 2 of them particularly had rings totaling 209 rings. So within a few, they were about 200 years old when they were harvested. That would make them saplings when John Smith explored the Rappahannock in 1608. And I just think it's fascinating that Smith might have walked by some of the trees that 2 centuries later would end up being built, used to build the house there at that same site. So, in the case of Belmont, the results of the dendrochronology show that the documentary record and our staff assumptions, sort of compiled over the years, were not too far off. By dating the harvesting of the structural timbers to the winter of 1799, 1800, we were able to say with a high degree of confidence that the house was built in 1800 by Alexander Vass. Or more accurately, by skilled and unskilled laborers, at least some, perhaps most of whom were black, and some or most of whom were probably enslaved. We don't know more than that really, because the 1800 U.S. Census for Virginia and all the information it contained was lost long, long ago, and that includes the slave schedule. So we have not found anything that tells us anything at all about what sort of enslaved population may have been there when Bass owned the property. But if something like that were ever come to light, I think we'd have a little more knowledge, potentially. We know increasingly more about J.B. Ficklin's enslaved population, but not prior. So that has helped us reset from circa 1790s to 1800 for the initial construction of the house. Now, more recently, that work was done in October of 2023, and we got the results early in this year, 2024. It is still 2024, this has been a long year. But earlier this month, in November of 2024, Dan Miles and Michael Cuba returned to Gary Melcher's home and studio to obtain samples from one of the oldest outbuildings associated with Belmont, the smokehouse. Now, we know the smokehouse moved at least once, a couple other buildings, but it was felt to be as close to an original companion to the main house as we had. So, as with the main house, the team searched for framing timber that was likely original and to contain areas of tree bark. You see here a sample, a couple samples. Now, the boreholes there I wanted to mention, generally, when this kind of work is done, a neutral plug, and there are different kinds of things that can be used, certain types of wood, certain types of resins, but most people who do dendrochronology do fill the hole back, and they try to do it in a way that will just keep the stability of that area. They put fungicide on it, and they just try to put back the mass that was taken out by the work. There are some people, some of the literature says don't do anything to it, but I think it's probably better that they put an inert material back in to just try and keep things as close to the original composition as they can. Another part of the evidence that they were using in determining what to look for in there and what to examine were the saw marks on a number of the boards. And this took me back to my Historic Preservation 101, practically, back in Mary, Washington, when we were looking at different things like the evolution of screw making technology or nail making. And sawing can provide you evidence as well. Many of you probably know. The top images here on the left, you see pit saw marks, on the right, sash saws. Now, pit saws, probably familiar with that, two men, and it's usually men, with a log in a pit, sawing vertically, one down below, one at ground level. And they can saw almost like the idea of a bandsaw, but it's going to be a bit irregular, it's a vertical mark. A sash saw is sort of an improvement on that and a mechanization of it by using usually a water-powered, or perhaps later a steam-powered, vertical saw in a frame. It could be wood, could be metal, but it was a bit more automated or mechanized. Still, it produced somewhat irregular marks when it was cutting. You get into the era of more modern band saws, you get more uniform cuts, and that will usually give you an indication it's a more modern working that's been doing on it. Now, circular saws on a sawmill level came in late in the 1800s, of course, with the advent of electricity, hand saw, circular saws, and they leave circular sawmills. So the top two are, more period examples. The bottom two much more recent for what these guys are looking for. So once again, steady rhythm of drills filled the air at our museum. In fact, it was a quiet Sunday when they were working, and Michael especially, he's younger, he got up there and he would have such a regular drill. He would go like in sequences of four. It was like, I mean, just perfectly timed. And I was in the house while they were doing this. I thought a cell phone was ringing or something somewhere. It took me a minute to realize, no, that's how regular, almost mechanical his drilling was. Very precise. And, if I can be a little poetic here, they were kind of placing a call. They were calling the past and hoping some of these old trees would answer. Anyway, they got the samples they were looking for, and once again, they did documentation of where they took them from, and the field notes that they compiled, and when they work up a more formal report, it will look a little more formal. They got 10 samples, I believe. Yeah, they got 10 samples this time out of the smokehouse, and these will be examined at the Oxford lab, just like their main house cousins, and we really eagerly await those results. So thank you for your attention to that. It's very exciting. We're very happy to be able to use science to help inform what other forms of research tell us, and when we have more to share about it, we certainly will. Thank you.